Chapter 12 in California Studies has to do with the fact that even with all this anarchy going on in early California, there was a certain amount of culture that evolved out of necessity. There were some early newspapers and literary magazines. The first issue of California's first newspaper, which was called the Weekly Californian, it didn't appear daily, it appeared weekly, appeared at Monterey on August the 15th, 1846, and the first issues of the Weekly Californian were printed on paper intended for cigar wrappings, if you can imagine that, because, well, quite frankly, paper was a little scarce at that time. Its first rival or competitor was Sam Brannan's California Star. You remember Sam Brannan, that upstanding leader of the California Mormons who used the Mormon tithes for his own purposes? So Brannan started a newspaper in January of 1847 called the California Star. Ultimately, the two papers merged after the gold rush began and published as a newspaper called the Alta California, beginning in January 1849, and that newspaper actually survived for 41 years, which is quite amazing. What you see here is a copy of the Alta California from December 31st, 1849, and UC Riverside has a pretty good archive of early California newspapers. If you want to log on there and read them, you can. At this point in time, then, hundreds of newspapers popped up, even in the small, dinky little mining towns of the Mother Lode in the Sierra Nevada foothills. In the 10 years following the gold discovery, 132 periodicals were started in the city of San Francisco alone, which is really quite amazing. By 1859, there were 12 daily newspapers in the city of San Francisco. I mean, it's rare anymore when one town has two newspapers. That used to be the norm in most substantial cities, but anymore, with the newspaper business changing here in California and really around the United States, you know that it's exceedingly rare when one town has two newspapers now. But in 1859, there were 12 San Francisco daily newspapers, including the Alta, the Herald, the Call, and the Bulletin. There were also some literary weekly and monthly publications and magazines. One of the writers of the 1850s in California was Louise Amelia Knapp Smith Clapp. Man, did she have a lot of names. But she went under the name of Dame Shirley. She wrote a series of a few dozen letters to her sister about what it was like to live in a gold mining area along the Feather River, which is essentially today northeast of Chico, I believe. She and her husband, who was a doctor, lived in a mining camp along the Feather River, and it was a pretty rough and tumble life. As she said, to be in an area where there was nothing was, really quite something. And these letters were first published in a short-lived literary monthly called The Pioneer. Then there was Lieutenant George H. Derby of the U.S. Topographical Engineers. He was a humorist, and he published some of his works in the San Diego Herald and The Pioneer under the pseudonym of Squibob, which is a Hebrew word for something to the effect of knock your eye out or something like that. A Hebrew word signifying there you go with your eye out, which is kind of weird. Alonzo Delano, not sure how to pronounce it, otherwise known as Old Block. He was also a humorist, and he published a book called Chips from the Old Block in early California. Then there was John Rollin Ridge, who was part Native American, and he went by the pen name of Yellowbird, and wrote what ended up being essentially a legend and not necessarily a lot of truth in it, The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, which over time became a very popular book to read. Then there was Francis Bret Harte, whose name under his publications was Bret Harte, spelled B-R-E-T, and actually his original last name did not have the E on the end, but he added it later. He was born in Albany, New York in 1836, came to California as a young man in 1854, followed a married sister to a town called Union, California, which is now Arcata, California, up in, that would be in Humboldt County, up near Eureka. This is where he wrote the account of the Indian massacre that I mentioned in 1860. In Chapter 11, this was mentioned to you, and you read it, of course. No doubt you're reading the chapters, you should. And at that point in time, after Harte had that account of the Indian massacre that he witnessed published, there were threats on his life. He became a major contributor to and editor to a periodical called the Overland Monthly, which was founded in San Francisco in 1868. He had a poem called Plain Language from Truthful James, which actually was renamed by people who read it. It was called The Heathen Chinese, which was actually not the title that Bret Harte gave this poem, and it unfortunately ended up being a poem that unintentionally contributed to Chinese stereotypes in early California. That was not his intent whatsoever. Then there was Samuel L. Clemens, a.k.a. Mark Twain, who was born in Missouri in 1835. He came to Virginia City in 1861 to mine silver, but didn't do so well at that endeavor and ultimately became a reporter for a newspaper in Virginia City called the Territorial Enterprise in 1862. He started using the pseudonym Mark Twain in 1863. The book explains what the term Mark Twain means, and you'll have to actually read that in the chapter to find out for yourself. He moved to San Francisco in 1864. He met Bret Harte there and started writing sketches for a publication called The Era. He was quite famous for his story of the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County. And of course, at the Calaveras County Fair every May, they have a frog jumping contest, even to this very day. Eventually, he ended up settling in Connecticut and lived for decades in Connecticut and published a lot of his works out of New York City. So he really didn't stay in California for very long. He published his accounts of what it was like to live in the gold rush, which were called Roughing It. They were published in 1872. Joaquin Miller, who was originally known as Cincinnatus H. Miller, that was his given name, but he got the nickname Joaquin. He was born in Indiana in 1837. There isn't a lot of factual knowledge known about him. He came to California in 1854. He had an Indian wife. Wrote a poem which glorified the Joaquin Murrieta legend, and apparently it wasn't a particularly good poem, and he was razzed a lot about it, and eventually both his friends and his critics started calling him by the name of Joaquin Miller instead of his given first name of Cincinnatus. He was, however, overwhelmingly accepted in England as the poet of the Sierras, so I suppose you could say a combination of fame and infamy for Joaquin Miller. Then there was Ina Coolbrith, who was born Josephine Smith, was actually the daughter of a younger brother of the prophet of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith. She arrived in California during the gold rush. She was escorted by the African-American trapper James Beckworth, who we mentioned in an earlier chapter. Her mother left the church when it started to embrace polygamy. She came to San Francisco after a divorce in 1865. She met Bret Harte and eventually became, for 20 years, not just an editor and poet, but also the librarian of Oakland, California. And she met Jack London when he was just a boy coming in to the library in Oakland, California to read books. There's an interesting connection for you. As far as churches and schools were concerned in early California, focusing specifically about San Francisco in this part, the first Protestant congregation in San Francisco was organized in 1848, a year before the gold rush, actually just a few months before the big gold rush, and was out of necessity a union of Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists, Episcopalians and Mormons, because they did not have their own preachers. But when the economy got going and San Francisco became more established as a city, they obviously split off and became, their own churches and parishes. Eventually, these denominations could then afford to have their own churches and pastors, and by 1852, about 3 years later, there were at least 30 places of worship in San Francisco. 22 of them were Protestant, and there were 6 Roman Catholic churches. Actually, there were 2 Jewish congregations as well in the Gold Rush era of San Francisco in 1852. Their members included prominent citizens and whose influence extended far beyond their numbers. For instance, you all know who Levi Strauss is. If you look at the label on the back of your jeans, you're probably wearing one of his products. Then there was Anthony Zellerbach and Aaron Fleshacker. These 2 gentlemen together founded a paper company. And of course, the Zellerbach Paper Company still exists today in California. There on your left is a picture of Levi Strauss with his famous, I should say, invention, the blue jeans. And then there's a picture of Anthony Zellerbach actually selling paper out of a horse-drawn wagon in the early days. Between 1846 and 1852, the number of Roman Catholic priests went from 13 to more than 100. Quite a bit of growth in the Roman Catholic Church in San Francisco and Northern California, which warranted the appointment of the first Archbishop of San Francisco in 1852, and his name was Joseph S. Alemany. If you go to San Francisco today, you know there is an Alemany Boulevard, no doubt named after him. Meanwhile, in spite of the fact that the churches did at least make an attempt to educate young people, the state government utterly failed to make adequate provisions for public education in schools. California's first public high schools, located in San Francisco and Sacramento, were not established until 6 years after statehood in 1856. It was reported, here's an interesting statistic, it was reported that between 1853 and 1857, California spent about $2,000 for each imprisoned convict, but only $9 per school child, if you can imagine that. Now, there are those that would argue that in California today, that same imbalance exists, that we are spending a lot more on prisons than we are in schools. So that was even an issue in early California. I refer you to the quote at the end of the chapter on page 166, which is a very, very, very strong quote. By 1866, largely through the efforts of John Swett as state school superintendent, several new laws had been passed expanding educational opportunity. For white children, though not for others, something like a decent public elementary school system was established by then, 1866 and beyond. But even this existed only in the larger towns. Such was the limited state of educational progress a full 20 years after the American occupation of California. That's a rather poignant quote, without question. This ends the narration for Chapter 12.